Some mistakes are worth a career. Others cost a lifetime. Stephen Matthews used to think of himself as the master of the situation. Expensive suits, high-end restaurants, deals made over a glass of wine. He already saw himself at the top of the corporate world. But at one dinner, his world would crumble. The waitress he hadn't even bothered to make eye contact with would turn out to be the person he least expected. A woman capable of turning his fate around in an instant. One hurtful gesture, one wrong word, one fatal mistake. And it's no longer up to him to decide who's worthy of respect. Now listen carefully, because this story isn't just about revenge. It's a story about power, the secrets of the past, and what happens when people forget that everyone can become a servant and everyone can become a master. Stephen Matthews adjusted his Rolex watch, a recent reward for closing the Peterson account, as he strode through the doors of the Southern Pearl. The restaurant wasn't his usual choice, but the client had insisted. Something about their famous shrimp and grits. The rich mahogany walls and crystal chandeliers surprised him. He'd expected something more modest. This place is definitely stepping up their game, he muttered to himself, smoothing his tailored suit. His client, Mr. Henderson, was already seated at a corner table, engaged in an animated phone conversation. Stephen's promotion to senior vice president hinged on this lunch. After 15 years of climbing the corporate ladder at Restaurant Co. International, he could finally taste success. A tall, elegant black woman approached their table. Her simple black dress was impeccably tailored, but Stephen barely glanced at her. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Olivia, and I'll be taking care of you today." Stephen waved his hand dismissively, not looking up from his phone. Yeah, bring us your wine list and some water. And make it quick. We're not here to waste time." Olivia's spine stiffened imperceptibly, but her voice remained professional. "Of course, sir." As she walked away, Stephen noticed Mr. Henderson's disapproving look. "What? Let's focus on business. I've got some exciting proposals for expanding Restaurant Co.'s reach in the Southeast." The lunch progressed, with Stephen growing increasingly frustrated as Olivia seemed to appear at their table at all the wrong moments, interrupting his pitch. Her timing couldn't have been worse. Just my luck to get the help that doesn't know their place, he thought bitterly. When she returned with their entrees, Stephen was in the middle of his presentation. "As I was saying, our profit margins could increase by 30% if we—" "Excuse me, sir," Olivia interjected softly. "Your seafood platter." Stephen's patience snapped. "Listen here, girl," he hissed, his voice low but venomous. "I don't know what kind of establishment you're used to working in, but where I come from, the help knows better than to interrupt important business conversations. Now, why don't you just shuffle back to the kitchen and let the adults talk?" The restaurant fell silent. Mr. Henderson's face turned ashen. Olivia placed the plate down carefully, her hands steady despite the trembling in her chest. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear as crystal. "Mr. Matthews, I believe we should discuss your employment with Restaurant Co. International. You see, I'm not just your server today." Stephen's smirk froze on his face. "I'm Olivia Washington, CEO and owner of the Southern Pearl Restaurant Group. And as of 3 months ago, when my company acquired Restaurant Co. International," she paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "I'm also your boss." The color drained from Stephen's face as he recognized the name. The same name he'd skimmed over in last quarter's merger documents. The same name that now appeared at the top of his paycheck. Mr. Henderson stood up abruptly. "I believe this meeting is over, Mr. Matthews. Ms. Washington, I apologize for my association with this incident. I'll be taking my business elsewhere." As Henderson walked away, Stephen sat frozen, his world crumbling around him. Olivia leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "By the way, Stephen, that promotion you were hoping for? The board meeting is tomorrow. I do hope you've prepared a compelling presentation about workplace diversity and inclusion." She straightened up, smoothing her dress. "Enjoy your seafood platter. It's on the house. Consider it your last meal at Restaurant Co." The other diners pretended not to watch as Stephen Matthews, his hands shaking, loosened his expensive tie. Through the window, he could see his career. 15 years of carefully constructed superiority shattering like the crystal glasses that adorned the tables around him. But what haunted him most wasn't the loss of his job or the public humiliation. It was the realization that the help he'd looked down on his entire life had been watching him all along, waiting for him to reveal who he truly was. And today he finally had. Olivia sat in her penthouse office, staring at the city lights below. The incident with Stephen Matthews still burned in her mind, though a week had passed. Her fingers traced the worn photograph on her desk. Her grandmother in a diner uniform, circa 1965. "I did it, Gran," she whispered. "But why doesn't it feel like a victory?" The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Washington, the board members are ready for the emergency meeting." Time to face the wolves, she thought. The boardroom was tense. 12 faces, 10 white men, 1 white woman, and 1 black man stared at her as she entered. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Let's address the elephant in the room," Richard Whitmore, the senior board member, began. "The Matthews incident has gone viral. Our stock dropped 3 points this morning." Olivia's voice remained steady. "Are we more concerned about stock points or addressing the systemic racism in our organization?" "Come now, Olivia," Sarah Peterson interjected, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing dismissively. "One unfortunate comment hardly constitutes systemic racism." One unfortunate comment. Olivia's mind flashed back to 20 years ago. "Mom, why are you crying?" a teenage Olivia had asked, finding her mother slumped over their kitchen table. "They passed me over again, baby. 20 years of service, and they made Jimmy shift manager." Jimmy, who's been there 3 months. Back in the present, Olivia straightened her spine. "Let me share something with you all. Before I bought this company, I was that waitress. Not just metaphorically. I actually waited tables in a restaurant co-establishment while putting myself through business school." The room shifted uncomfortably. Station 47, Atlanta, 2003. "I served many of you, actually." She locked eyes with Richard. "You like your coffee black, no sugar, Mr. Whitmore. You never looked me in the eye, not once." Richard's face reddened. That's preposterous. I would have remembered. Would you? Do you remember the names of any servers who've served you in the past 20 years? Silence descended on the room. Meanwhile, across town, Stephen Matthews sat in his modest apartment, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and newspaper clippings. His laptop displayed article after article about the incident. "This can't be happening," he muttered, scrolling through comments calling for his head. His phone buzzed. Another message from his mother. "Stephen, please call me. We need to talk about what your father did." He deleted it like all the others. His father was the last person he wanted to think about right now. Back in the boardroom, Olivia was fighting her own battle. "The numbers don't lie," she presented. "In our company's 40-year history, only 2% of upper management has been people of color, despite making up 60% of our workforce. And you plan to change this overnight?" Sarah scoffed. "Based on one incident? No, Sarah. Based on thousands of incidents. Based on my mother's tears. Based on my grandmother cleaning tables for pennies while raising 3 kids alone. Based on every person of color who's ever been told to shuffle back to the kitchen." The room grew quiet. "I moved to terminate Matthews immediately," Richard suggested, clearly hoping to end the uncomfortable discussion. Olivia smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Actually, I have a different proposal. Mr. Matthews will remain with the company." Gasps filled the room. "In fact, he's being reassigned. Starting Monday, he'll be working as a server at the Southern Pearl, under my direct supervision." "You can't be serious," Sarah sputtered. That's humiliation." "No, Sarah. That's education." Olivia's voice was steel. "And anyone who has a problem with this new direction is welcome to tender their resignation." As the board members filed out, Olivia's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Ms. Washington, you don't know the whole story. Your grandmother and my father. There's something you need to know. Stephen Matthews." Olivia's hand trembled as she read the message again. The photograph of her grandmother seemed to stare back at her with newfound intensity, holding secrets she never knew existed. Stephen's hands shook as he straightened his black server's apron. 3 weeks into his re-education at the Southern Pearl, and the weight of his new reality crushed him daily. The kitchen's heat felt suffocating, so different from his old, climate-controlled office. "Order up for table 7. The head chef's voice boomed. "Just breathe," he told himself. "You can handle this." His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another message from his mother. "Stephen, please. Your father's getting worse. He keeps talking about Rose Washington. We need to talk about what happened in '73. He silenced the phone, but his mother's words echoed in his mind. Rose Washington, Olivia's grandmother. The connection he discovered while diving into old family records had nearly made him sick. Across the restaurant, Olivia watched Stephen struggle with a heavy tray. Her satisfaction at his humbling had slowly transformed into something more complex. The viral video of their confrontation had sparked a national conversation about workplace discrimination, but something about Stephen's last text message nagged at her. "Ms. Washington?" Her assistant appeared. "There's something you need to see." The assistant handed her a tablet displaying an anonymous email sent to all board members. Did anyone bother to investigate how Olivia Washington really acquired Restaurant Co? Ask about the fire at the original Southern Pearl in 1973. Ask about Rose Washington and Henry Matthews. The truth will destroy everything. Olivia's blood ran cold. The fire that had killed her grandmother. She'd always believed it was an accident. In the kitchen, Stephen was living his own nightmare. A customer had just berated him over cold soup, and his former colleague James was dining with clients, smirking at Stephen's downfall. "Not so high and mighty now, are you, Matthews?" James whispered as Stephen refilled his water. Stephen's grip on the pitcher tightened. "You know, James, I used to be just like you. God, it makes me sick now." "Please," James scoffed. "Save the redemption arc. We all know you're just playing nice until this blows over." "Table 12 needs attention," the manager called out. As Stephen approached table 12, he froze. Sitting there was his father, looking frail in his wheelchair, with his mother standing nervously behind him. "Son," his father's voice cracked. "We need to talk about Rose." "Not here," Stephen hissed. "Not now. It's eating him alive," Stephen, his mother pleaded. "The guilt, the truth about the fire. Is everything all right here?" Olivia's voice cut through the tension. She'd been watching the scene unfold and couldn't stay away. Stephen's father looked up, his face ashen. "My God, you look just like her. Just like Rose." Olivia's professional mask slipped. "You knew my grandmother?" "Knew her?" The old man's laugh was bitter. "I loved her, and my guilt over her death has haunted me for 47 years. The restaurant seemed to fade away as the old man continued, his voice trembling. "Rose and I were going to run away together. Leave everything behind. But my father, he found out. A prominent white businessman's son and a black restaurant owner? He couldn't have that scandal." Olivia gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. The fire was meant to destroy the restaurant, not kill anyone. But Rose was working late that night. When I found out she was inside, his voice broke. "I tried to run in, but they held me back, made me watch it burn." Stephen stared at his father in horror. "All these years, my own grandfather. I married Stephen's mother 2 months later, like a good son. Built a life on shame and regret." The old man reached for Olivia's hand. "Your grandmother built that restaurant from nothing, and my family, my cowardice, destroyed it all." Olivia pulled away, her world spinning. "So, when I bought Restaurant Co., you bought the very company my father built from the insurance money he collected after burning down the Southern Pearl." The old man's words fell like bombs in the quiet restaurant. All eyes turned to the restaurant's entrance as Richard Whitmore burst in, waving papers. "Olivia, the board just received proof that your acquisition of Restaurant Co. was funded by insurance fraud money from 1973. They're calling for your immediate removal." He stopped short, seeing the tableau before him. Olivia straightened up, her voice deadly calm. "Actually, Richard, I believe we've just uncovered something far more interesting about Restaurant Co.'s true origins. And I don't think the board will like this story at all." The boardroom felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. 2 days after the restaurant revelation, Olivia sat at the head of the table, a thick folder of documents before her. The board members shifted uncomfortably under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Before we begin this emergency session," Olivia's voice cut through the tension, "I'd like to introduce someone." The door opened, and Stephen wheeled his father in. Richard Whitmore's face turned ghostly white. Henry Matthews, Olivia announced. Son of Charles Matthews, Restaurant Co.'s founding father. He has quite a story to tell. This is it, Stephen thought the moment everything burns down, hopefully for the right reasons this time. Richard jumped to his feet. This is preposterous. We're here to discuss the fraudulent acquisition of. Sit down, Richard, Henry Matthews commanded, his frail voice carrying unexpected authority. You're just like your father was, always protecting the family secrets. Olivia opened the folder. Let's talk about those secrets. Starting with this insurance claim from 1973, signed by Charles Matthews and... She paused significantly, Thomas Whitmore. Richard sank back into his chair. Your father was the insurance adjuster who helped cover up the arson, Stephen said, the disgust evident in his voice. Our families have been built on this lie for generations. The boardroom erupted into chaos. Sarah Peterson's shrill voice rose above the others. This is ancient history. It has no bearing on. It has every bearing. Olivia slammed her hand on the table. Your precious Restaurant Co. was built with blood money, my grandmother's blood money. Every franchise, every profit margin you've celebrated, was born from an act of racial violence. Henry Matthews coughed, drawing all eyes to him. I've signed a full confession. The police have copies, as do several news outlets. He looked at Olivia, tears in his eyes. It won't bring Rose back, but maybe it can start to make things right. Stephen moved to stand beside Olivia, removing his server's apron. I've spent weeks serving tables, thinking it was punishment. But it taught me something about humility, about seeing people, really seeing them. How touching, Richard sneered. But confessions or not, the shareholders will be fascinated to learn that their company was founded on insurance fraud and murder, Olivia interrupted. Unless what? Several board members asked simultaneously. Unless we use this moment to transform Restaurant Co. into what it should have been from the start. Olivia projected a presentation onto the wall. I propose a complete restructuring. 50% of upper management positions reserved for minorities. A foundation in my grandmother's name to help minority-owned restaurants. And a Truth and Reconciliation Committee to address our company's history. The room fell silent. You're crazy, Sarah whispered. The shareholders will never. Actually, Stephen stepped forward, they might. Because I've spent the last week contacting our major shareholders. Many of them are very interested in avoiding a public scandal. And some, he smiled grimly, are quite enthusiastic about being on the right side of history. Richard's face contorted with rage. You ungrateful little. Choose your next words carefully, Richard, Olivia warned. The press is already gathering downstairs. One by one, the board members began to nod, seeing the writing on the wall. Richard, realizing he was losing control, played his last card. Fine, but Matthews is finished. Both of them. We'll need scapegoats for the old regime, and they're perfect. No, Olivia said firmly. Stephen stays as our new chief of diversity and inclusion. Stephen's head snapped up in surprise. You can't be serious, Sarah gasped. Who better? Olivia asked. He's lived both sides of this story, and he's earned a chance at redemption. As the board members filed out, their worlds forever changed. Stephen turned to Olivia. Why? He asked simply. Because my grandmother believed in second chances. And because... She was interrupted by her assistant, bursting into the room, panic on her face. Ms. Washington, it's all over the news. Someone leaked documents showing that Rose Washington had a child before your mother. A child with Henry Matthews. Stephen and Olivia turned to Henry, who was staring at the floor. Dad, Stephen's voice cracked. I thought she died in the fire with Rose, Henry whispered. But I just found out she survived. She was adopted. And her daughter, he looked up at Olivia, is you. The room spun as the implications hit them. Stephen wasn't just the son of the man who loved her grandmother. He was her uncle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Olivia's office as she stared at the DNA test results on her desk. After 3 months of investigations, background checks, and genetic testing, the truth was undeniable. She wasn't just the owner of Restaurant Co. She was a Matthews by blood. How many more times can my world shatter and rebuild itself? She wondered. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Stephen stood in the doorway, his face showing the same strain that had aged them both considerably over the past months. "The press conference is in an hour," he said quietly. "Are you ready?" Olivia laughed bitterly. "Ready to tell the world that I'm the secret love child of a forbidden relationship? That my greatest enemy is actually my uncle? That everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie?" "Our family," Stephen corrected gently. "For better or worse." The word family hung heavy in the air between them. In the conference room downstairs, Henry Matthews sat with Olivia's mother, Clara. They'd spent weeks piecing together the past. "I never knew," Clara whispered, holding the old photograph of her birth mother, Rose. "Mama never told me I was adopted. She just raised me as her own after Rose." "She was protecting you," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like Rose tried to protect your older sister, Olivia's birth mother, by giving her up for adoption before she could build her restaurant empire. And now, both my sister and her daughter ended up in the restaurant business anyway," Clara marveled. Rose's legacy lived on, despite everything. The press conference room was packed. Cameras flashed as Olivia approached the podium, Stephen and their family behind her. She gripped the edges of the lectern, her knuckles white. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "Today, Restaurant Co. isn't just announcing a corporate restructuring. We're confessing to a 50-year-old crime, acknowledging a legacy of racism and violence, and revealing a truth that will change everything." As she spoke, telling the story of Rose and Henry, of fire and redemption, of hidden children and buried secrets, the room fell silent. "But this isn't just about the past," she continued. "Today, we're launching the Rose Washington Foundation with a $1 billion commitment to support minority-owned restaurants and provide educational opportunities for their children." Stephen stepped forward. "We're also establishing truth and reconciliation committees in every state where we operate. No more hiding. No more shame." A reporter stood up. "Ms. Washington, how can you work alongside the very family that destroyed yours?" Olivia felt Stephen tense beside her. She took a deep breath. "Because hatred perpetuates hatred. Because my grandmother Rose loved Henry Matthews enough to risk everything. And because sometimes," she looked at Stephen, "family is found in the most unexpected places." Another reporter. "Mr. Matthews, how does it feel to know your company was built on such a tragic foundation?" "It's not my company anymore," Stephen replied. "It belongs to the people who should have owned it all along. My role now is to ensure we never forget how we got here." As the questions continued, Olivia felt her phone buzz. A message from an unknown number. "Rose would be proud. M." Attached was a photo that made her heart stop. A young Rose Washington, standing in front of the original Southern Pearl. But it wasn't the image that shocked her. It was the woman standing next to Rose, an elderly white woman wearing a familiar locket. The same locket that was currently around Richard Whitmore's neck. Olivia's hand trembled as she zoomed in on the photo. The woman's features were unmistakable. She was Richard's grandmother, Margaret Whitmore. And according to the caption, she was the original silent partner who helped Rose start the Southern Pearl. Olivia looked up at Richard in the back of the room, his face a mask of barely contained rage. He touched the locket unconsciously, unaware that he was wearing the evidence of his family's deepest betrayal. The truth, Olivia realized, isn't finished with us yet. She caught Stephen's eye and showed him the photo. His eyes widened in recognition. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. "One more thing," Olivia addressed the crowd, her voice steady. "It seems we've discovered another chapter in this story. Richard, would you like to explain why your grandmother's locket is in that photograph? Or shall I?" The cameras turned to Richard as the color drained from his face. The locket slipped from his fingers, clicking open as it hit the floor. Inside was a yellowed piece of paper, the original deed to the Southern Pearl, signed by both Rose Washington and Margaret Whitmore. Equal partners. The truth had finally come full circle.